Of all of the mysterious and intriguing things that are caused by the Earth's moon, one affects me and you and everyone else in apparently the same way, but we don't really know why, and we aren't really even fully sure if it's true. It seems to be true. So on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we're going to talk about one effect of the moon on us, and we're going to ask the cards about what their thoughts are on the phases of our work and lives and see what they have to say. I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet only on YouTube. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. And if you've already subscribed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. And if you have a Brave browser, you can contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening. Remember this story I told a long time ago about a guy who said that he could tell you where he was on Earth if only you gave him a toilet to flush, and by knowing what the direction of the water that goes down would be, he would tell you where if he's in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. Now, we know that that's not really the case. That is too small of a system to reflect the Coriolis effect. That's the sink or a tub or toilet. Too small. You need to be kind of hurricane size to really see the effects of this and have difference in rotation there. But I was thinking the other day that if that same person had said, just give me a few days and clear skies where I can see the moon, then I can tell you what latitude I'm on, then I think they would have a much better chance of being right about that. And why is that? Well, you might know that the moon is what scientists call tidally locked or tidally locking. There's apparently a debate over which term to use. I don't understand why, but if you're a scientist who works on the moon and happen to be listening to this, please continue to listen because I'll have a question or two for you. But that's one of my questions is what's the big deal about tidally locking or tidally locked, or what's the difference? Okay. So what that means is that the moon is basically rotating kind of in, I'll just say, kind of in a fixed way in relation to Earth, so that we only see one side of the moon. If you're a Pink Floyd fan, you already know this from the album The Dark Side of the Moon. Sometimes people call it the far side of the moon. I saw that in some articles recently. But the point is that it's the part of the moon that is never facing the Earth. Is that 50% of the moon? The answer, lunar scientists will tell you, is no. There's a thing called libration, which has to do with the kind of fact that a little bit of the far side of the moon or dark side of the moon can actually be visible depending on your perspective on Earth and so forth and other factors. And so that means that we can actually see about 59% of the moon. So it's not half and half. Nothing is precise, as you know, in the universe. And this is also similar. So the dark side and light side of the moon are not always dark or light, so to speak, because we can sometimes see more of the moon than other times. But it's not much. It's only about 9% more. And that's that. Now, to get back to the determining what your latitude is, the reason this can happen is that the phases of the moon, which are new moon, meaning there's no moon visible, and that has to do with the position of the moon relative to the sun. And it's when it's completely in the shadow of the sun. And so it's only illuminated by, and this is a new term for me, earthshine. I knew there was sunshine, but who knew? There's also earthshine. And so that's a new moon. Not really. So it means you can't really see the moon, though for reasons of inexactitude, there might be a very small edge that you can actually technically see. But that let's not get into that. And again, if you're a moon scientist, please explain in the comments. And then the next phase of the moon is what is called a waxing crescent. And depending on which hemisphere you're in, either the right side or left side will be illuminated, but only in what is called a crescent shape. And that's the funny thing about the waxing crescent, is that the waxing part is just an English word that means growing, and it's from a kind of Germanic root that has to do with to grow or increase. And the crescent part, the word crescent, is actually from a Latin word that also has to do with grow, cresco, which is I grow. So the waxing crescent is the growing moon. So that's interesting. But there's also a waning crescent, wane to be meaning to become smaller. That happens later on the other side of the cycle. But the point is that in the which side is illuminated of that crescent, that depends on whether you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. And there's also a thing that, and this is where I get into the latitude thing, depending on your latitude, the crescent will rotate either counterclockwise or clockwise, more rotation, so that you'll see it at a different angle. So that if you're at the equator, you'll see the crescent is completely on top of the moon. So that's and then it continues to turn, so that if you're at the South Pole, the crescent is on the left side of the moon as you're looking at it. But if you're at the North Pole, it's on the right side of the moon. And that means that everywhere in between the North Pole and the South Pole, the phase of the moon is going to be turning ever so slightly, so that if you had a sense of what degree of latitude looked like based on the moon phases, maybe you had a chart, maybe you memorized them, you can roughly guess where you are in terms of latitude north and south of the equator. Now, after the crescent, we have what is called a first quarter moon. And what that means is that it is basically a half moon. And the same is true on the other side of the month for the third quarter moon, which is the half moon, but just on the other side of what you saw in the first quarter moon. So the different half is, the opposite half is illuminated. And there's no second quarter moon or fourth quarter moon. That's it. The thing that's I guess would be the second quarter moon is the full moon, which is self-explanatory. You could see all of the moon. And that's where the interesting thing comes in about the moon's effect on human beings. That's kind of inexplicable, and scientists still can't figure out why this may be the case, if it is the case, which it seems like it is the case. And what that is that sleep scientists have found in multiple studies, though one had slightly different results regarding the new moon, but they found in multiple studies that people go to bed later in the days leading up to the full moon. People have their sleep cycles are slower to getting into the rapid eye movement sleep, that deep sleep that you have. And the sleep was shorter than the other times of the month. And also the sleep was less deep. There was more waking up. And so there's an interesting thing going on there, and there's really no way to account for it. The obvious, common sense thing would be like, well, it's brighter out because of the moon. But the thing about these studies is that the most extensive ones of them did it in places where they were, tested for, there's places where there's no windows, so there's the illumination of the moon doesn't matter at all for the sleep study participants. And the same thing happened to them, even though the actual no percentage of the illumination of the moon could reach them. So what it is exactly about the moon when it is fully illuminated by the sun once a month is not so clear. Oh, and after the full moon, you have phases that are called gibbous or gibbous. I tend to say gibbous, but that's just my choice. I think a lot of people say gibbous as well. And that's spelled Gibbous. And you could be waxing gibbous or waning gibbous, depending on if the moon's illumination is growing, waxing, or waning, shrinking. And the whole gibbous thing is related to actually a Latin word that has to do with the way the moon appears to be humped, because it's not a half moon, it's not a full moon, so there's a kind of rounded part of the moon where the change is happening, and so it looks like the moon is kind of the kind of elliptical shape of it is kind of humped. So that's why it's called gibbous, and that happens on either side of the full moon. And then you have the third quarter moon, and then finally you have the waxing crescent, which then turns into that new moon at the end of the time that the moon does its cycle, which in English we call a month, and that's where the word month comes from, just an old English word for moon, interval of time. So let's ask the cards what phase of our life we're in right now and what we should do about it. And so here we go. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles, cards, tell us some things. It's card 51. Being a different you teaches you a lot about the regular you. So imagine that you have one new identity completely different from one of the many identities you have right now. So you might choose an identity that you wish you knew something about. Perhaps it's something you've always imagined yourself doing in terms of work and life, but you've never done. So explain what that means about you and what you need to do in your usual life to activate that. So what identity popped to mind? Say that out loud, and why do you think you thought of that? And think about what that means about what you need to do starting in this phase of the moon.